Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get into today's story. It all started in the bustling city of New York. Daniel Williams, a 38-year-old self-made millionaire, was at the peak of his career. Known for his sharp business acumen, Daniel had built a fortune in tech and finance over the past decade. But despite his success, he was struggling with one thing, his personal life. The relentless pressure of his career left little time for relationships, and his social life had taken a back seat. He was a man of ambition, but that ambition had come at the cost of meaningful human connection. One day, while sitting in his penthouse office overlooking the city, Daniel received an unusual proposition from his lawyer. It wasn't an offer about a new business venture or a high-stakes deal. No, this was something completely different, a marriage contract. The offer came from a wealthy family looking to secure their daughter's future by arranging a marriage with someone of status. Their daughter, Lily Sinclair, was an aspiring artist with a sharp mind and an independent spirit. But she had one problem: her family's wealth depended on her marrying into the right social circles. Daniel, who had been widowed for a few years, had no intentions of remarrying, but the contract made an intriguing offer: marry Lily for a year, and in return, he would receive a sizable sum of money to expand his latest business venture. At first, Daniel rejected the idea, thinking it absurd. He had no desire for a fake relationship. But as his business needed capital for an upcoming project, and after careful consideration, he began to see the practicality of the arrangement. It was temporary, no emotions involved, and it could benefit both parties. So, after much deliberation, he agreed. It wasn't long before Daniel and Lily met. She was everything he wasn't expecting: bright, independent, and fiercely opinionated. He had assumed she would be a typical socialite, focused only on appearances and status, but she wasn't like that at all. Lily was reluctant at first, unsure about the terms of the arrangement, but she too realized that this was a solution to her family's pressure. The terms were simple: live together as a married couple for 1 year, attend social events, and keep up appearances. No strings attached, no romantic obligations. But as they began their lives together, something unexpected happened. The lines between fake and real started to blur. Their interactions, initially cold and businesslike, gradually became more comfortable. Daniel began to see a side of Lily that no one else saw, a woman who cared deeply about her art, who had dreams beyond the expectations of her family. He found himself drawn to her energy and passion, something he hadn't felt in a long time. But Lily too began to change. She had always believed that money and status were the only things that mattered, but Daniel showed her a different world. A world where hard work and authenticity were valued over appearances. The more time they spent together, the more Lily started to feel like the relationship was no longer just a contract. The attraction was real, and as much as she tried to push it away, she couldn't deny it. As the months went by, the line between what was fake and what was real became harder to distinguish. Their initial agreement was simple, but feelings had begun to develop, and neither Daniel nor Lily knew how to handle them. They were bound by a contract, but now, they were facing a new reality, one where their hearts had become part of the equation. So, let's pause for a moment and think, what will happen when two people enter a fake relationship, but end up falling in love? Will they continue to honor the terms of the contract, or will they risk it all for something real? Let's go back to our main characters and find out. After the agreement was signed, Daniel and Lily's lives began to change in ways neither of them expected. They moved into a luxurious apartment in downtown Manhattan, a place that would serve as their new home for the next year. The apartment was exactly what you would imagine for two high-profile individuals, sleek, modern, and full of sophistication. But despite the extravagant setting, the atmosphere was far from warm. It was professional, almost clinical. There was no romantic spark, no love, only two people fulfilling an agreement. Daniel, being the successful businessman he was used to maintaining control, and he applied the same approach to his new living situation. He treated it like any other business deal, efficient and to the point. Lily, on the other hand, was adjusting to her new life, but in a different way. She had always been independent, and this arrangement, while practical, felt like a constant reminder of how much she had to sacrifice for her family's expectations. She wasn't happy about it, but the weight of her family's pressure, coupled with the opportunity to secure her future, kept her from backing out. In the beginning, it felt like nothing more than a contract, no affection, no emotional connection. They ate meals together, attended events together, and lived together, but there was no real partnership. But as the weeks passed, something started to shift. At first, it was small, little gestures of kindness that didn't feel forced. A morning cup of coffee, shared glances when no one else was looking, and casual conversations that didn't feel entirely transactional. Daniel found himself genuinely interested in Lily's thoughts on art, her ambitions, and the way she saw the world. She wasn't the typical woman he expected to marry for money or status. There was depth to her, something beyond the surface. Lily, too, began to see Daniel in a different light. While he was driven and focused, there was a vulnerability to him that she hadn't noticed before. It wasn't about the money or the business deals. Daniel cared about success, but he also seemed to care about the people in his life, even if he didn't always show it. The more she got to know him, the more she realized that her initial judgment of him as just another wealthy businessman was far from accurate. One evening, after a charity gala they attended together, they sat in the back of a private car heading home. It had been a long night, full of pretentious conversations and shallow small talk, and for the first time in weeks, Lily felt drained. She leaned back in her seat and sighed deeply, catching Daniel's eye. She smiled faintly. "It's just one of those nights." He nodded. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Then, Daniel broke the silence. Lily was taken aback by his question. It was the first time they had discussed anything personal, anything that didn't involve their arrangement. Daniel's gaze softened. "I get that." There was a pause. For a brief moment, the walls between them seemed to lower, and something raw and honest passed between them. As they arrived back at the apartment, the conversation faded, but the connection lingered. Neither of them knew it yet, but that small moment had shifted something. It was the first crack in the facade they had built around their arrangement. They were still living a lie, but now, that lie was starting to feel less like a contract and more like a complicated, emotional journey. The next few days felt different. Daniel started making an effort to spend more time with Lily, not out of obligation, but because he actually wanted to. He took her to a private gallery showing for an artist she admired. He listened intently as she talked about her dreams, her struggles, and what she wanted to achieve in life. It was clear she was more than just a woman caught up in a family obligation. She was driven, passionate, and full of potential. Lily, too, began to open up more. She stopped seeing Daniel as just a business arrangement and started seeing him as a person. She noticed the way he worked tirelessly on his projects, how he pushed himself to succeed. There was something inspiring about that, something that made her want to work harder to make her own dreams a reality. As time went on, they started to spend more time together outside of their obligations. They had dinner together almost every night, and on weekends, they'd explore the city. Slowly, they began to share more personal details about their lives. Daniel revealed the pain of losing his wife a few years ago, and Lily shared the pressures of living up to her family's legacy. Despite their growing connection, neither of them was ready to admit that something more was happening between them. The arrangement was still in place, after all. But the emotional distance between them was starting to close, and both of them could feel it. The question now wasn't whether they could continue pretending. It was whether they were willing to confront the truth, about their feelings, about their future, and about the contract that had brought them together in the first place. But that question would have to wait for another day. For now, they were still playing the roles they had agreed upon. But in the back of their minds, both Daniel and Lily knew something was changing, something neither of them could control. As the weeks passed, the dynamic between Daniel and Lily continued to evolve. What had started as a cold, contractual arrangement was slowly becoming something more personal, more intimate. They spent more time together than ever before, each of them learning things about the other they never expected. Daniel began to notice the little things about Lily, the way she smiled when she was truly happy, the way she was passionate about her artwork, and how she wasn't afraid to speak her mind, even if it made others uncomfortable. It was a refreshing change for him, someone who had spent so many years surrounded by business deals and boardroom politics. He found himself drawn to her energy, her confidence, and the way she wasn't afraid to chase her own dreams, even if they didn't align with her family's expectations. Lily, too, was beginning to see Daniel in a different light. At first, she thought of him as just another rich businessman, someone whose life was ruled by power and money. But the more she got to know him, the more she realized that there was so much more beneath the surface. He wasn't just a businessman, he was a man who had suffered loss, someone who had built his empire out of sheer determination and drive. And as she spent time with him, she began to understand his vulnerabilities, his need for control, and his complicated past. What she once saw as arrogance was now something she saw as a defense mechanism, something that kept him from letting anyone in. One evening, as they sat on the balcony of their apartment overlooking the city, Lily turned to Daniel. The sky was painted with hues of orange and pink, the city lights flickering below them like tiny stars. Daniel looked at her, his expression unreadable. "You mean the arrangement?" Lily nodded. "Yeah. At first, I didn't think I could do it. I thought it was just a way for my family to control me, to make sure I didn't mess up their plans. But now, I don't know. It's complicated." Daniel didn't speak at first. He just watched her, his eyes studying her face. There was a long pause before he finally responded. Lily's eyes met his, and for the first time, they both understood the unspoken truth between them. The contract was no longer just a contract. They were no longer just playing roles. What had started as a deal between two people who had nothing in common was turning into something deeper, something neither of them had planned. The following days were filled with tension, both of them trying to navigate the growing attraction between them while still honoring the terms of their arrangement. They continued to attend high-profile events, charity galas, and business meetings, but the moments between them were different. They found themselves sneaking glances at each other during dinners, exchanging smiles when no one else was looking, and sharing private moments that seemed to blur the lines between their public personas and the real connection that was developing. One night, after a particularly glamorous fundraiser, Lily was in the bathroom of their apartment, taking off her makeup. As she looked at herself in the mirror, she couldn't help but feel conflicted. The life she was living, this glamorous, high society world, was nothing like the life she had imagined for herself. She had always dreamed of becoming a successful artist, to build her career on her own terms, not because of her family's expectations. But here she was, caught in a contract that was supposed to keep her family's legacy intact, and yet it was pulling her in a completely different direction. As she stepped out of the bathroom, Daniel was sitting on the couch, scrolling through his phone. He looked up when she entered the room, his eyes softening as he saw the expression on her face. Lily hesitated for a moment, then sat down beside him. I don't know anymore, Daniel. I came into this thinking I could keep everything separate. My life. My family's expectations. The contract. But I'm starting to realize that I can't keep pretending forever. I'm not just a pawn in some game. I'm a person, and I have dreams. Daniel's gaze softened, and for a moment, the business tycoon was gone, replaced by a man who understood what it was like to feel trapped by expectations. I get it, he said quietly. I've spent my entire life building my company, but in doing that, I've lost sight of what really matters, what I want. I understand what you're going through, Lily. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their conversation hanging in the air. Neither of them had the answers yet, but they both knew something was changing. The feelings they were trying to suppress had been growing stronger, and the contract they had signed was starting to feel like it was holding them back rather than protecting them. But just as quickly as the moment began, it ended. They both stood up, unsure of what to say next. The silence between them was uncomfortable now, filled with the unspoken truth that neither was ready to face. As the days passed, their relationship became even more complicated. What had been a business transaction was now a tangled web of emotions, desires, and fears. Neither Daniel nor Lily could deny the undeniable attraction between them. But with the contract still in place, they had to continue pretending that everything was fine, that nothing had changed. But deep down, both of them knew that the line between fake and real had already blurred. And once that line was crossed, there was no turning back. As the days turned into weeks, the tension between Daniel and Lily became palpable. Their relationship, which had started as a business arrangement, was now more complicated than either of them could have imagined. They still went to events, still played the part of the perfect couple in public, but in private, everything was shifting. The boundaries they had so carefully placed between themselves were beginning to crumble. Each passing day brought them closer, and the line between what was real and what was fake was becoming increasingly blurred. One evening, as they sat in the living room of their apartment, the soft glow of city lights outside casting a warm hue across the room, Daniel put down the book he had been reading and looked at Lily. He had been thinking about her a lot lately, about the woman she had become in his eyes, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something needed to change. Lily looked up at him, her heart racing. She had been feeling the same way for weeks, but hearing him admit it aloud sent a wave of emotions crashing over her. She had spent so much time convincing herself that their feelings were just a phase, something that would fade with time. But the truth was undeniable. Now. Daniel leaned back, running a hand through his hair. I didn't expect this, Lily. When I agreed to this arrangement, I thought it would be simple. Just a way to get the business capital I needed, a way for you to keep your family happy. But now, he paused, as if searching for the right words. Now it feels like I'm falling for you. And I don't know what to do with that. Lily felt a lump form in her throat. She had spent so much of her life trying to control everything, her career, her image, her family's expectations. But this was something she couldn't control, and it terrified her. There was a long silence between them, the weight of their confessions hanging in the air. For a moment, neither of them knew what to say next. They were both caught in a web of emotions they hadn't planned for, a web that was slowly pulling them in. Finally, Daniel stood up, walking over to the window, his gaze fixed on the city skyline. I don't want to hurt you, Lily. I never wanted to complicate your life. But I can't pretend like this doesn't matter to me anymore. Lily stood up as well, moving to stand next to him. She looked out at the city, the same view they had shared countless times, but now it felt different. It felt like everything was changing. Daniel turned to face her, his expression softened with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. So what do we do now? Lily swallowed hard, her mind racing. She didn't have the answers. They had both entered this arrangement for practical reasons, for things that seemed to make sense at the time. But now, everything felt uncertain, unpredictable. Daniel reached out, gently taking her hand in his. For the first time in their relationship, there was no pretense, no contract, just two people standing together, unsure of what the future held but willing to face it together. As they stood there, in the quiet of their apartment, the world outside seemed to fade away. There were no contracts, no obligations, just the raw reality of what they were feeling. For the first time in months, both Daniel and Lily felt like they were no longer pretending. They were no longer just fulfilling a role, they were two people who had shared something real. But despite the raw honesty between them, neither of them was fully ready to let go of the past. The contract still hung over their heads, and the consequences of breaking it were unclear. So, as much as they wanted to believe in the possibility of something real, the reality of their situation still loomed large. For now, they could only take things one step at a time. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, they were willing to face it together. It wasn't a fairy tale, and it wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. And as they stood in the quiet of the room, neither Daniel nor Lily could deny that their lives, and their relationship, were about to change forever. In the days that followed their conversation, Daniel and Lily found themselves walking a fine line between what they had agreed to and what they were now feeling. The contract, still very much in place, loomed over them like a shadow, but neither of them could deny that something real was growing between them. The walls they had carefully constructed around their emotions were crumbling, and the connection they had started to build was becoming undeniable. But even as they became closer, they both knew that the situation wasn't simple. The agreement they had signed was still binding, and if they allowed their feelings to cross that line, the consequences could be far-reaching. The tension was palpable, not only between them but also in the decisions they had to make moving forward. For the first time, Daniel felt conflicted about his business mindset. His usual approach was to make calculated decisions, to always keep emotions at arm's length. But with Lily, everything felt different. Every time they spoke, every time they were together, he felt an overwhelming desire to let go of the rigid control he had always kept in his life. Lily, too, was struggling with the shift. She had always believed in keeping her heart guarded, in keeping her emotions separate from her decisions. But Daniel had slowly become more than just a business arrangement to her. He wasn't just the man she was legally tied to for the next few months. He was someone she cared about deeply, someone who had come to mean more to her than she had ever anticipated. One afternoon, as the two of them sat in their favorite cafe in downtown Manhattan, Daniel's phone buzzed on the table. It was a message from his lawyer, reminding him of the terms of the marriage contract. It was a simple message, a business formality, but it hit Daniel like a punch to the gut. He looked at Lily, his brow furrowed, and she saw the change in his expression instantly. Daniel didn't reply right away. He stared at the phone, his mind racing as he weighed the options in his head. The contract was still there, still real. But so was what he felt for Lily. He couldn't deny it any longer. What had started as a business deal had evolved into something far more complicated. He couldn't keep ignoring it. Lily nodded slowly, as if she had known this moment was coming. She had felt it too, the shift in their dynamic, the way things were becoming impossible to ignore. They had entered this arrangement with clear boundaries, but those boundaries had been tested time and time again. And now, the question was whether they could keep pretending, or if they had to face the reality of their feelings. Daniel's gaze softened as he looked at her, and for the first time, they both allowed themselves to truly feel what was between them. The business arrangement, the contract, all of it seemed to fade away in that moment. All that remained was the undeniable connection they had forged. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. The world outside the cafe seemed to blur as they both struggled with the weight of their feelings. The future was uncertain, and they both knew the risks of letting their emotions take the lead. But in that moment, it didn't matter. What mattered was that they were here, together, and everything else felt irrelevant. Lily didn't hesitate. She had been thinking about this for days, wondering if they could continue on the path they were on. Could they keep playing the part of a married couple when everything inside her told her that it was real? Could they maintain the pretense, or would they have to confront the truth? Daniel looked at her, his eyes searching her face for any sign of doubt. But all he saw was truth. Lily was right. They couldn't keep up the charade. They were no longer two people bound by a contract, they were two people who had grown to care deeply for each other. And pretending otherwise was only going to make things harder. Lily took a deep breath. She didn't have all the answers, but she knew one thing for sure, they couldn't keep going down this path without acknowledging what was happening between them. Daniel nodded slowly, his mind already working through the possible consequences of such a conversation. But he knew she was right. They couldn't keep going on like this, hiding behind the contract. If they were going to move forward, they needed to be honest with themselves and everyone around them. For the first time since they had entered this arrangement, Daniel felt a sense of clarity. It wasn't going to be easy, and the road ahead would be filled with challenges. But one thing was certain, they were no longer living a lie. Whatever came next, they would face it together. As they left the cafe and stepped into the cool evening air, both of them knew that things were about to change. They had no idea what the future held, but for the first time, they were ready to find out. As Daniel and Lily walked out of the cafe, the weight of their conversation lingered between them. The cold night air was a sharp contrast to the warmth they had just shared, but somehow, it felt like a turning point. They had crossed a line that had once separated their contract from their emotions, and now, there was no going back. They both knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but it felt like they had finally acknowledged what had been building between them for months. The next day, they sat down together in their apartment, the soft hum of the city outside the windows. There was no more pretending, no more hiding behind the charade of a marriage that wasn't real. It was time to face the consequences of their actions and figure out where to go from here. Lily took a deep breath, her eyes meeting his. For so long, she had lived under the pressure of her family's expectations, always trying to do what was best for them, for their legacy. But now, for the first time, she was doing something for herself. She wasn't sure what the future would look like, but she knew she couldn't keep living in the shadows. Daniel nodded, his eyes filled with understanding. He had always been a man of control, a man who made decisions based on logic and strategy. But this situation, this relationship, had taken him by surprise. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew that Lily was right. They had to be honest, not just with their families, but with themselves. "All right," he said, taking her hand in his. "We'll do it together. No more pretending. Let's face whatever comes next, as a team." With that decision made, they both knew the hard part was just beginning. The next few days were filled with tension as they prepared to have the conversations they had been avoiding. Daniel called his lawyer, making arrangements to modify the contract, to make it clear that their arrangement had evolved into something far different from what they had originally agreed upon. Lily, on the other hand, called her parents, asking to meet with them to talk about everything. When the day finally came, they met at a quiet restaurant, the kind of place that was reserved for serious conversations. Daniel sat across from Lily, his jaw clenched in nervous anticipation. Lily's parents arrived soon after, both of them dressed to impress, as always. They took their seats at the table, and the air was thick with unspoken tension. Lily's father, a stern man in his late 50s, was the first to speak. "I assume you have something to tell us," he said, his tone cold and authoritative. Lily's mother, on the other hand, sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, observing the situation with a look of quiet curiosity. Daniel exchanged a glance with Lily, and she gave him a small, reassuring nod. This was it. The moment they had been dreading, and yet, they both knew it was necessary. Her father's expression hardened, his eyes narrowing as he processed her words. "Feelings," he repeated, his voice dripping with disbelief. "You're telling me that this arrangement, this business transaction, turned into something more?" Lily nodded, trying to remain calm. "Yes, that's exactly what I'm telling you. We didn't expect it, and we tried to ignore it, but it's real. And I can't pretend it isn't." There was a long pause as her father glared at Daniel, who remained silent, waiting for the storm to pass. Finally, her father spoke again, his voice low and controlled. Lily's heart sank, but she didn't back down. "I know what's expected of me, but this isn't about that anymore. It's about what I want. And I can't keep living my life based on other people's expectations. I'm sorry, but I need to follow my heart." There was a moment of silence as her father processed her words. Finally, he leaned back in his chair, exhaling sharply. Her mother, who had been silent up until now, finally spoke. "Lily, you've always been a strong woman. I can see that this is important to you. Just know that whatever happens, we'll support you. We just want you to be happy." The conversation wasn't easy, but it was necessary. Daniel and Lily left the restaurant later that evening, the weight of their parents' reactions still heavy in the air. But despite the tension, they both felt a sense of relief. For the first time, they had been honest about their feelings, about their relationship, and about what they truly wanted. As they walked back to their apartment, hand in hand, they knew there were still challenges ahead. They weren't out of the woods yet, but they had taken the first step toward a future that was no longer dictated by contracts or family expectations. And that felt like the beginning of something real. The days following their conversation with Lily's parents were tense, filled with uncertainty and a deep sense of change. The air between Daniel and Lily seemed to crackle with both anxiety and hope. They had taken a huge step by confronting their families, and while the response from Lily's parents had been less than warm, there was a sense of freedom in finally being honest. Still, the weight of the situation lingered. Their future, which had once seemed so certain, now felt full of unknowns. Daniel and Lily spent the following week in a kind of emotional limbo, not fully knowing what the next steps would be. There was no turning back from their decision to be honest, but there was also no clear path forward. As much as they had shared their feelings with each other and their families, they still had to navigate the consequences. They still had to figure out what was next for them, both as a couple and as individuals. One evening, as they sat in their apartment, the quiet between them was filled with the unspoken realization that they could no longer live in the shadows of their past decisions. Daniel finally broke the silence, his voice steady but carrying the weight of the decision he was about to make. Lily looked up at him, her heart pounding in her chest. She had been thinking about this every moment of every day, and now that the conversation had finally come, it was both terrifying and thrilling. Daniel nodded, acknowledging the truth of her words. "I know. But I can't keep pretending. This," he gestured between them, "this is real. And I think it's time we stop living for everyone else's expectations and start living for ourselves." Lily stood up, walking over to the window where the city lights twinkled in the distance. The weight of everything they had been through felt like it was closing in on her. She had spent her life living according to her family's rules, and now that she had finally admitted her feelings for Daniel, the idea of stepping away from everything was daunting. Daniel walked over to her, his presence reassuring. He gently turned her to face him, his hands resting on her shoulders. Lily met his gaze, her heart filled with both fear and a strange sense of relief. For so long, she had lived in the shadow of her family's expectations, always doing what was expected of her. But now, for the first time in her life, she was faced with the chance to choose her own path. Daniel smiled, a small but genuine smile that made her heart skip a beat. "On our terms," he echoed, as if the words had a weight of their own, a promise to each other that they would navigate whatever came next together. With a deep breath, they both knew what they had to do next. The decision had been made. There was no more pretending, no more hiding. They would face the future together, whatever it held. It wasn't going to be easy, but they were ready to fight for what they had. As they stood there, side by side, looking out at the city together, it was clear that this was a turning point in their lives. They weren't just taking a step forward as a couple, they were stepping into a new reality, one where they would no longer live for the expectations of others. They were finally living for themselves. The decision had been made, and Daniel and Lily knew there was no turning back now. As they stood together in their apartment, side by side, they both felt the weight of the moment. It wasn't just about them anymore, it was about their future, the future they were choosing for themselves. They had come so far, from an arrangement that was purely business to a place where their feelings for each other were undeniable. But as they both knew, the road ahead was uncertain. Their families, their careers, and their reputations were all tied to the decisions they had made, and breaking away from those expectations was going to be harder than they had ever imagined. The next few days were a whirlwind of emotions and decisions. Daniel and Lily knew they had to prepare for the fallout. They had already taken the first step by being honest with each other, but now they had to face their families and the consequences of their choices. Lily's father had made it clear that he wasn't pleased with her decision, but he had also given her the space to make her own choice. Her mother, on the other hand, had been more supportive, though she, too, had her doubts. Daniel's family had been silent so far, but he knew they wouldn't be pleased either. No matter what, they had to be prepared for the challenges that lay ahead. As the days went by, Daniel and Lily had several difficult conversations, not only with their families but also with each other. They talked about their dreams, their fears, and what they really wanted out of life. The more they talked, the more they realized that they both wanted the same thing, freedom. Freedom to live their lives on their own terms, to follow their hearts, and to build a future that wasn't defined by the expectations of others. One evening, as they sat together in their apartment, Daniel looked at Lily, his expression serious but filled with tenderness. Lily nodded, feeling a sense of relief wash over her. The weight of their decision had been heavy on her shoulders, but now, with Daniel by her side, she felt stronger than ever. The words felt like a weight being lifted off her chest. For the first time in a long time, Lily felt free. Free from the pressures of her family, free from the expectations that had always been placed on her. And in that moment, she knew that she had made the right choice. Daniel smiled at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pride and affection. "And I choose you, too. We've been through so much, and now it's time for us to write our own story. Together." They both stood up, moving toward the window to look out at the city below. The skyline stretched out before them, a vast, endless expanse. It was both intimidating and exhilarating, a symbol of the unknown future that lay ahead. But for the first time in a long time, neither of them felt afraid. They didn't know what the future held, but they knew one thing for sure, they were in it together. And that was all that mattered. As they stood there, side by side, the world outside seemed to fade away. They were no longer living for others, no longer bound by the expectations of their families or society. They were free to build their own future, a future that was theirs and theirs alone. And as they looked at each other, they knew that the hardest part was behind them. The choice had been made, and they were ready to face whatever came next, together. In the weeks that followed, Daniel and Lily took bold steps toward their new future. They faced the challenges that came with breaking away from their family's expectations, but together, they navigated through it all. There were moments of doubt, of fear, but there was also an overwhelming sense of relief. They were finally living life on their own terms, free from the weight of pretending. They worked through the complexities of their family's reactions, knowing that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. But as long as they had each other, they felt ready for anything. Their decision to be honest, to choose each other, had changed everything. It was no longer about fulfilling obligations or following a script. It was about creating a new reality together, one that was built on trust, respect, and most importantly, love. They moved into a new home, one that symbolized their fresh start. It was not just a place to live, but a symbol of their shared commitment to the future they had chosen. One evening, as they sat on the balcony of their new apartment, watching the sunset over the city, Daniel turned to Lily. There was a quiet contentment in his expression, a sense of peace that had been missing for so long. He reached over, taking her hand in his thumb gently brushing over her fingers. Lily smiled, looking out at the cityscape before her. "All the time," she said. "There were so many times I didn't think we'd make it. So many obstacles, so many doubts. But look at us now." She glanced at him, her eyes filled with love. "We're living our truth, Daniel. And that's all that matters." Daniel nodded, squeezing her hand gently. "It wasn't easy, but we did it. And now we get to build something real, together. Something that no one can take away from us." There was a long pause as they sat in silence, the sounds of the city below mixing with the quiet of the evening. It felt like everything had finally fallen into place. They had both risked everything, lives built on carefully constructed expectations, only to walk away from it all to be with each other. But now, there was no more pretending. No more living for anyone else's approval. Lily leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling the weight of the world lift off her shoulders. "You know," she said softly, "I've spent my whole life following everyone else's rules. I didn't even know what it felt like to truly follow my own heart until I met you." Daniel smiled, his heart swelling with affection for her. "And I've spent my life building walls, trying to protect myself from getting hurt. But with you, I feel like I can finally breathe. Like I'm not afraid of what comes next, because I know we'll face it together." They both fell silent, the full weight of their shared journey settling in. They had come from different worlds, one born from wealth and expectation, the other shaped by loss and ambition. But they had found each other in the midst of it all, and somehow, they had created something stronger than either of them had ever imagined. As the sky darkened and the first stars began to appear, Daniel and Lily made a promise to each other without words. They had already taken the hardest steps, facing their feelings, telling the truth, breaking free from the past. Now, they could finally begin to build the future they had always wanted. They weren't just living for today, they were living for every tomorrow. Together. And as the night wrapped around them, the promise of their future felt brighter than ever.